What's going on, Packer fans? Happy Saturday. Welcome into an all-new episode of the Pack a Day podcast. I'm your host, Andy Herman. You can follow me on Twitter at Andy Herman NFL. Thanks so much for being here. Hopefully your weekend is treating you well. Getting set for Packers and Chargers on Sunday, which should be a pretty interesting game. We'll get to the full preview in tomorrow's episode. Today's primary objective and core of this episode is going to be about why this game is sneakily, bizarrely important to this Packers franchise and to the rest of this season. We'll get into that in just a moment, but let's start with the injury report. Some good news, some bad news. The interesting news is Rashan Gary. Rashan Gary was added to the injury report as questionable. They said he had a bit of a mishap in practice on Friday, which led to a shoulder issue. It's not expected to be long-term, but he is questionable to play this weekend. That is a potential game changer this week. As much as this game looks daunting as is against this Chargers offense and how talented they are and how they can put up points, doing that without Rashan Gary, we saw they couldn't stop Kenny Pickett and the Steelers this past week with Rashan Gary. Trying to stop Justin Herbert and the Chargers without Rashan Gary doesn't sound super fun. Now, potentially, they could be getting two big-time defensive players back. Jair Alexander and Quay Walker, both questionable for this game, per Matt LaFleur in his press conference. Jair, it sounds like they want him to play, and even if he's not 100%, they will potentially play him, unless there's risk of re-aggravating the issue to a serious extent. I would bet, based on him practicing the last couple days, that they're going to do everything in their power to let him play against this Justin Herbert supercharged, no pun intended, Chargers offense. But I've been up and down on Jair all week. When he was just on the bike on Wednesday, I didn't think there was much chance that he was going to play. And now 2 days later, 2 consecutive days of practice, it looks like he will, but we're going to have to wait till the inactives at 10:30 a.m. on Sunday for that. Quay, I expect to play. I think if the probable designation existed still, I think he'd probably be probable. He practiced every practice from Wednesday on, and there has been no setbacks, at least reported. So I would expect Quay to play in this one. Rudy Ford is doubtful. He did not practice all week. I would expect him not to play in this. But clearly here, the Rashan and Jair, the big ones. I expect Quay to play, expect Rudy Ford not to play. If they have Jair and Rashan, well, that certainly gives them a much better puncher's chance at trying to win this week. If they do not have either, good freaking luck. If they have one or the other, we'll see. It's going to be a really tough day on defense, but as you can imagine, Rashan and Jair, extremely, extremely important to this defense, trying to shut down Justin Herbert, Keenan Allen, Austin Eckler, and friends. Without both of those guys, I just think it's a lost cause. You're probably not being able to pull a rabbit out of your hat and getting a victory without those two premium players, especially Rashan Gary and the way that he has been playing. So hopefully both are able to go, especially Rashan, and hopefully the setbacks or the shoulder issue and the mishap is not anything that's going to just linger on. It doesn't sound like it will, but man, those things can be frustrating and those things can always linger a little bit. And that just is absolutely what Green Bay needs to avoid right now, especially not only now, right? Detroit on Thursday, Kansas City the following week. These are two big time players and Green Bay's desperately going to need those two premium players against those really three tough upcoming opponents, including the Chargers, the Lions, and the Chiefs. All right, this is a little bit of a different sort of episode for you today. What I want to go through is what the rest of this season could sort of look like, and specifically why this Chargers game is so important to how the rest of the season could legitimately look. I get there's probably 3 different sorts of fans right now, and let me just say I love all 3 of you. The first one is the cockeyed optimist of, hey, I want to go out. I think this team can still win every game. I want them to win every game. I want them to try to make a run at the playoffs or at least be really good and finish the season really strong. And I think this team, I think they can still do something special in this season. If that's you, that's awesome. But if that's you, this Chargers game really, really matters to those hopes and dreams. If you're somewhere in the middle, if you're like, hey, realistically, I totally get this Packers team's probably not going to make any crazy run at anything, but I just want them to be competitive. I want them to show signs of progress. I don't care about draft position. I want good games on Sundays. I want them to win games. I believe that winning breeds winning and that, they need to learn how to win as a football team. And I just want to see good, competitive, winning football. If you're in that camp, awesome. I'm mostly in that camp too. But I get if you're on the outside or on the fringes, that's fine. But I think that's probably somewhere in the middle. And then the other one is you are Captain Tankfest. You want every loss that you can possibly get. And maybe I think you probably still want competitive football, really tight games. Maybe you're losing by a last second field goal in each of them. And it's really fun football on Sundays to watch and competitive. And there's still those signs of growth, but you want that top 5 draft pick. You don't care about the wins and losses this year, or maybe you're even a step further than that and you think that this organization needs major change. And the only way that that major change is going to come is through chaos, is through a ton of losses. And with that could come that potential change. If you're on that side of things, I get it. I understand it. I'm not there, but I understand it wholeheartedly. And there's different variations of that, but basically that, hey, I just want to go out and win every game and I'm going to remain optimistic about the season. I'm realistic, but I want good football and I still want as many wins as we can get. Or I'm ready for chaos. Give me a really high draft pick and whatever comes with that, I'm cool with it. Any of those is fine, but this game might just be what all of that sort of hinges on, and whether this team is, hey, maybe we can put together some wins and maybe we have a chance at this. Or, hey, at least it was competitive, at least it was better, and we got to win against a pretty darn good Chargers team, even though they don't actually win football games. They're still talented. Or it's like, if you're cheering for the chaos, like a win against the Chargers is probably not what is in your directive or initiative or what you're trying to go for at this point. And this game really, really matters, because I do think, as much as it may not look it on paper, and especially with maybe the updated injury report with Rashawn Gary, I do think Green Bay can come away with the victory in this one. I really, really do. And in order to sort of look at how this season could go the remainder of the way, I think it's important to start by looking at the schedule. They have the Chargers this week at home. They then have those 2 really difficult games, short week on the road, Thursday football, morning game against the Lions. That's going to be extremely tough. You then have a little extra time off, but then you've got the Chiefs and Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid and Travis Kelce and Chris Jones and all the whole kit and caboodle for Sunday Night Football after that in a really difficult game at Lambeau Field. Those are going to be 2 incredibly difficult games following this Chargers game. You then have 5 mostly winnable games: Giants on the road, Buccaneers at home, Panthers on the road, Vikings at home, Vikings on the road, and then Bears at home. That is a fairly winnable group of games overall. The hardest of that being the Vikings, and they don't have Kirk Cousins. They will definitely have Justin Jefferson at that time, barring a setback from him or a new injury. Dobbs has been really interesting, but we don't need to necessarily break that down game by game. But I think if we're looking at it, the Chargers one is a difficult one, but maybe a slightly, if not improbable, winnable one. 2 really tough games that you're probably expecting 2 losses, and then 5 games that could go in a variety of different directions. But let's play this out for a minute, because this is where I think things get a little bit interesting. And I want to be abundantly clear. If you're thinking that I am going into this saying that, hey, with a few strings of luck here or there, the Packers could make this crazy run into the playoffs, I do not believe that. I do not believe that this team is good enough to put any sort of stretch of games together to actually make a run at the playoffs. If you had to tell me right now that this team either loses all of their games the rest of the season or makes a run into the playoffs, I would be closer to that loses every game the rest of the season, even though they have some very winnable games on the schedule. I'm not saying either of those extremes are going to happen, but I'd be closer to that side. So no, if you're thinking this is that cockeyed optimist, like the rose tinted lenses, and I'm just going to be a super homer and be like, hey, I think let's get this going. I think Green Bay can. That's not what I'm doing here. But I do think how the rest of the season progresses hinges a lot on this Chargers game. So let's start with a win against the Chargers this Sunday. They win against the Chargers. They move to 4-6 on the season. I think we can safely assume 2 losses to the Chiefs and the Lions. I don't think that's breaking any news. Can anything happen on any given Sunday, or in next week's case, any given Thursday? Yes. Would crazier things have happened in the history of the NFL than a Packers win against the Lions or the Chiefs? Yes. Bigger upsets there have been. But I think if we're being honest, we are probably chalking those 2 games up to losses ahead of time. If they surprise us, awesome. But I think if we're being realists, we're saying those 2 are losses. So assuming, again, if we say win against the Chargers and then those 2 games are losses, you are sitting at 4-8. 4-8's not great, clearly, but you're not eliminated from anything yet. And I'll say one more time, I'm not saying this as a, hey, let's make the push towards the playoffs. But in Green Bay, in the coaching staff, in the front office, they will look at 4-8 They will remember what they did last year at 4-8, reeling off 4 consecutive wins to get to 8-8 and have a game at the end of the season to potentially go and, get into to the playoffs. And they're going to look at it very similarly, and they're going to say, let's go out and beat the Giants. Let's go out and beat the Bucks and the Panthers. And all of a sudden we're at 7-8. We've got the Vikings. Maybe we can get to 8-8. And then we've got the Bears. Maybe we can get to 9-8. And if we get to 9-8, maybe we got a chance to win this thing. And that is what I think is very important to understand here. If they are 4-8 following the next 3 games, win against the Chargers, 2 likely losses to the Chiefs and the Lions, and they're 4-8, they're going to look at that like, hey, we're not eliminated yet. Let's go out and see what can happen. And you have enough crappy teams on the schedule to then maybe like put together some wins. If they go to New York and get that win, they are 5-8. They come back home and face the Buccaneers, and then they go 6-8. And then they face the really bad Panthers team on the road, and then you go 7-8. And then you've got the Vikings on the road, really tough game, no question about it. But Vikings on the road, they've won in Minnesota before, and they've got Josh Dobbs at quarterback, who's been playing pretty darn well. I get that. But you just won 3 games in a row. You beat the Giants, the Bucks, the Panthers. You're feeling yourself a little bit. You have a little bit of momentum. Maybe you go 8-8, and then you've got the Bears. And again, I'm not saying that that's realistically going to happen or that this team has the capacity to reel off any sort of winning streak at this point, but that is how it will be viewed in the front office. And if you are 4-8, you go to New York and you lose, all right, then that's done. When you get to 9 losses, you're basically eliminated at that point. But if, again, every win that they pick up is going to push them further into, hey, let's do everything we can to put our best unit out on the field and go and try to win games. And again, we'll go through those 3 scenarios again. If you are on the, hey, I think that's awesome. I think we should be trying and hoping to make a run at the playoffs. And I'm super optimistic that this team could still put something magical together. Then that's a good thing. If you are in the realism category of like, hey, I don't think it's going to happen, but hey, I'll take any wins I can get. Great. If you're on the other side of things and you're like, hey, I kind of don't want that. I want the early pick and I want something other than that, then that doesn't sound so great. It maybe, prolongs the inevitable where eventually they're going to get eliminated from the playoffs. And in the meantime, you're gaining a bunch of empty calories where it looks like, hey, we got wins, but really you beat a Giants team with no quarterback. You beat a Bucks team at home that's not very good. You beat an awful, awful Panthers team, probably the worst team in the league on the road. And yeah, you picked up some wins, but you're still eventually going to get eliminated and it doesn't amount to much of anything. But that's why that Chargers game is so interesting, because on the other side of things, if you lose that Chargers game, right, you move to 3-7. And now if we're assuming those 2 losses to the Chiefs and the Lions, you move to 3-9. You go to 3-9, you are eliminated. And they may not ultimately be eliminated. Like they could still be like mathematically like a possibility in the playoffs. But at that point, they know that at 3-9, they are legitimately going, there's no future for this season. And at that point, then things change in Green Bay. And even Green Bay and them being the sort of, old-fashioned team that they are, and looking at everything in sort of that optimistic viewpoint, at that point, they understand that they have lost 8 out of 9 games, that there is no future for this season, and that it is time to start looking towards next season's, meaning it's probably time to put Sean Ryan at right guard. It's probably time to end the Yash Nyman experiment because he's probably not going to be on the team next year, and you live with whatever Rasheed Walker gets you. Or you try Caleb Jones, or you try Luke Tenuta if he's back from injury, or you try something different at that position. Maybe you try some different things out on the offensive line. Maybe you give Emmanuel Wilson a little bit more run at running back. Maybe you go more Carl Brooks and Colby Wooden along the defensive line. Those sort of things. Maybe you make sure that Anthony Johnson Jr. is starting every game at safety. Maybe you make some changes within the coaching staff or within the coordinator positions and give somebody an opportunity to see what they can do for the remainder of the season. Then at that point, things have to be taken a little bit differently. Again, knowing that you lost 8 out of 9 games and that you're basically, if not officially eliminated, all but eliminated from playoff contention at that point. So why that matters is, and why this Chargers game matters, is it, in my opinion, changes the entire trajectory of the season. Again, if you think this needs to get blown up and everything needs to go in the direction of getting an earlier draft pick, then you really need to cheer for a Chargers or like a loss to the Chargers here. Because again, a win against the Chargers, regardless of what happens in those next two games, you then go to New York with the real like hope and possibility of like, hey, we can string together some wins against some bad teams, and that could prolong out for a while, and you could pick up, like I said, some of those empty calorie wins. And if you are in the, hey, I want to remain competitive and I really want this season to matter and mean something, you really better hope for a win against the Chargers, because a loss against the Chargers and then two subsequent losses against the Chiefs and the Lions puts you out of everything, and this could start getting uglier before it gets better. And if you're Matt LaFleur, Joe Barry, Adam Stenavich, this game probably matters a ton, because that changes the entire dynamic of how this is viewed. Like I said, you have lost 8 of 9 if you lose these next 3 games, which is probably fairly likely. But if you want to pick up a win and you want to prolong that and go to New York with everything still in front of you, at least hypothetically, then you better win this game against the Chargers, because the next 2 games are going to be much harder even than this one, and this one's no walk in the park, especially with the way that Green Bay's been playing overall through the course of the season. So in easiest terms, if they go to New York 4-8, they are still going to do everything they can to win. They're still alive. 9-8 is a real possibility based on the schedule, and they have a lot of winnable games left on their calendar. If they go to New York 3-9, losers of 8 out of 9, you have to inherently switch some things up, whether that's coaching staff, whether that's players on the field, and you just have to start immediately looking towards next year and just giving different guys different opportunities, because there's no reason not to at that point. And then that's where you can start getting into you could lose to New York, you could lose to Tampa, you could lose to some of those games, and all of a sudden, before you know it, you end the season 4-13, 5-12, whatever it might be. And that has a totally different connotation to it as well. So that is why I believe that this game is this weird, bizarro shatter point for the remainder of the year, and could very legitimately decide some people's jobs in the coaching staff. It could decide who's back next year. It could decide who gets extra playing time this year. It could mean the difference between going, 7-10, 8-9, and 4-13, 5-12, somewhere in that range. This game really matters a ton. And when you look back a couple years, from now, you could look back at this game and be like, man, that's where things really started to unravel. Or, man, that's where things really started to pick up and get better. If you remember in McCarthy's first season, they ran off 4 games at the end of that year. They were 4-8, and I think they ran off 4 in a row to get to 8-8. And then this was not Rodgers' first year. This was still with Favre, but it was McCarthy's first year. And that winning at the end of it, of that season, carried over into the next year. They won 13 games the next year, went to the NFC Championship game, and everything sort of changed. A winning streak at the end of a season can kickstart you into next year and can get some young guys confidence. And I think, again, if you go and you get a win against the Chargers, regardless of what happens in the next 2 games, you go to New York and you're still playing your full deck of cards. You're playing your best hands possible, and you're hoping that you can pick up some more wins, and maybe they can get 4 out of 5 at the end. And I mentioned this on Twitter. You look at that schedule, it could be eerily reminiscent to what happened a season ago. Last year, they were at this exact same record, 3-6. They had a home game against the Cowboys, which didn't look like they were going to win. They had an improbable win against the Cowboys. That would be your Chargers game. They then lost the next 2 games to the Titans and the Eagles. That would be your 2 losses to the next 2 weeks to the Lions and the Chiefs. They then reeled off 4 in a row. Green Bay could reel off 4 in a row, theoretically, against the Giants, the Bucks, the Panthers, and the Vikings. And then they had a NFC North game at the end of the year to get in the playoffs. That was against the Vikings. This year, they could have a NFC North game to get in the playoffs in the last week against the Bears. It could all very much repeat history. I don't expect it to. I'll say that one more time. But it's crazy how the parallels could be there if a couple things fall in the right direction. So this, to me, is very much a swing game for the remainder of the season. It could be a pivot point in this franchise. If guys do get fired because the rest of the season goes very poorly, you could easily point to this Chargers game and say, here's where it all fell apart. If they end up with a top 5 pick in the draft, you could look at this Chargers game and say it started to happen specifically right there. And if they, like I said, if they go on some sort of crazy win streak, I don't expect it to be playoffs, but if they start looking like a competitive team again, and a team that is maybe really going in the right direction, gaining some positives to hopefully carry over into 2024, you could look at a win against the Chargers and say, that's where it all started. So that's what I'll say. I think this game is incredibly important to the remainder of the season and maybe even where things go moving forward with this franchise. And if they want good things, they better get a win. If they want bad things, you better hope for a loss. And whatever spectrum you fall on, good, realistic, ugly, I get it. I understand it. I hope all of you get what you want. Only two of you, or at least only one of you maybe will. But it's interesting nonetheless. And I do think this game is really important for the franchise, the season, and everything moving forward for this very young, very inexperienced, but sort of talented Packers team. All right, that's going to do it for me today. Tomorrow, I will do the full pregame show and go over my keys to the game, my final prediction, and what could get you to a Chargers win or a win against the Chargers, or what could get you to a loss against the Chargers, if that's what you're hoping for. But we'll get there tomorrow and break everything down. Make sure to check out the pregame show. Make sure to check out Pack a Day podcast memberships if you have not checked them out as of yet. Huge opportunities for some really cool perks, including connecting on social media, a monthly call if that's something that you want. You can have members-only Q&As. You can have members-only videos every single week. There's a ton of different perks and options available, so make sure to check those out. Shout out to our All-Pro and Hall of Fame members, Most Hated Minnesotan, PJ Wayne, John Wild, Shea Bradad, Arnaldo Espinosa, Jennifer Wright, Boomhandle, Donald Lee, and Lori Lord. That is going to do it for me today. Until next time, and as always, go Pack-O.